It is September 6, 2024. Nearly 4 years ago, I recorded a video describing how Governor Whitmer was raiding the teachers' pension system by diverting funds away from it. Well, here we go again. This time with the aid of the Legislative Democrats, Governor Whitmer is again diverting funds away from the pension system and raiding it. So for those that aren't aware, the system is called the Michigan Public School Employee Retirement System. It's kind of a mouthful. It's typically called MPSERS for short. Who's eligible for it? Well, in your local school district, anyone who's a teacher, custodial staff, bus driver, anyone who's employed at that public school is eligible when they reach a certain age and after they've worked a certain number of years, they can earn a retirement income when they retire. We have two big reasons why we have to make sure that this fund is solvent and is properly funded. First, it's the right thing to do to make sure we can pay those people who earned a benefit. We have to make sure we fulfill our obligations. That's a constitutionally protected benefit, so there's no way getting out of it anyway. The second important reason why we have to make sure we properly fund this, because we owe it to our kids. We spend a ton of money on this every year. It's taking a lot of money out of the classroom, and if we just keep kicking the can down the road, these obligations are just going to balloon and it will get more expensive over time, and we don't want to get in a situation where we can't properly fund our children's education. I do want to close the loop on what happened after that first video. Long story short, the governor, through the use of her bureaucrats at the Office of Retirement Services and the MPSERS Retirement Board, had erroneously increased what was called a payroll growth assumption. It didn't sound like a very big deal. It was increased a relatively small amount in the grand scheme of things. But that little shift was diverting a lot of funds away from the system. It was also skirting a state law that I had sponsored and got signed into law in 2018. But I have good news. Through House Bill 6357, when I was serving in the House in 2022, I was able to stop that diversion of funds. I got the payroll growth assumption lowered back down. I was House Appropriations Chair at the time, and I was able to, through negotiations with the budget, I was able over 2 years and a lot of arm wrestling with these bureaucrats in order to get that problem solved and to stop that diversion of funds. So I'm going to talk a little bit high level of what MPSERS is first, and then I'll get into how the Democrats are doing it this time around. So just for those that aren't aware, what are we looking at? The pension system right now is $32.3 billion in debt. To put that in scale, the entire school budget for 1 year is roughly about $20 billion. So it's a massive number. And this is where it gets tricky. So the MPSERS system is divided up into two different components. You have the pension system, which is the retirement income. You also have a retiree health care portion. It's commonly called OPEB. That stands for Other Post-Employment Benefits. That was in a substantial amount of debt until recently. In 2011, Governor Snyder started pre-funding the retiree health care. So actually, in the most recent audited financial, it shows a surplus. It's a surplus of $650 million right now. And this is where the diversion of funds is taking place. I'll get more into that as we go forward through this, but I want you to keep in mind there are two components within the pension system, within the retirement system. There's the pension, which is your retirement income. There's also the retiree health care, which is a health care benefit. I also want to give a little scale as to how much we pay every year as a proportion of our actual school budget. So for the 2023 school year, the pension contribution was $4.84 billion. That was our mortgage payment, $4.84 billion. The OPEB contribution for the retiree health care was $783 million. You add that up, you're looking at about $5.5 billion going into the MPSERS system. Looking for that at that same school year, the total state restricted spending for our entire school budget was $16.96 billion. So taking that as a whole, we spent 33% of our state restricted dollars was spent into the pension system to pay for obligations of yesterday. To put that another way, for every dollar you spent in taxes for schools that year, 33 cents went into the pension system. It was not going into the classroom. This is a huge problem, and it's been growing over years, and I've been working on a lot of reforms to try to right the ship, and when funds are shifted away from it, it's going to make it a lot harder to stay on course. So I'm going to put all of the links for this data in the description, so if you want to verify it, it's in there, feel free, and I hope you take a look at it. So next I want to start with my time in the legislature back in 2017. So I actually came from working at the pension system. I worked for 3 years as an investor. After I graduated from Michigan State at their business school, I got a job as an investor at the state pension fund. So I know the system inside and out. I worked inside of it for 3 years, as I said. And then in 2017, pension reform was the biggest issue in that year. To kick off my time in the legislature, I was the chair of the House Financial Liability Reform Committee. So the first thing I did was look at the system and just do an analysis and do due diligence to see what the problems are. One of the problems was we weren't making our payments on a regular basis. So if you looked back 10, 15 years, every year we would make a payment when the budget was done, and then later in the year, through all the actuaries and all the accounting stuff that has to go on, later in the year we'd actually get the bill. So there's a timing issue there. And what was happening is we were constantly underfunding what that bill was, not every year, but most years. And some of those years significantly underfunding it. There were 2 years where we were almost 30% underfunding our annual payment for the year. So I wanted to come up with a way to try to address that one problem. So the first step was in 2017 when we did a big pension reform. It was Senate Bill 401. I put a floor funding provision in there. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but basically what it said was whatever your contribution rate was for that year, the next year you can't pay less than it. So it just was trying to get at that, how we were constantly going up and down with our annual payments. It was trying to say, all right, let's at least try to stop these 30% drops. Let's try to mitigate that. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was at least one thing we could do to help. So later in the year, ORS came to my office and they said, hey, since that's a contribution rate floor, which is a proportion, not a specific dollar amount, we've actually, not knowing it at the time, but we've accelerated our debt payments by 2 years. So instead of paying off our debt by the year 2038, we're going to pay it off by 2036. At first I was like, well, great. I'm fine with paying off the debt as soon as possible. This is a good thing. But what I saw this as an opportunity, because the other reason why we were underfunding our annual payments was due to what's called the payroll growth assumption. At the time, they were assuming 3.5% annual payroll growth for the public school system. But if you look back at the data, that wasn't happening. Demographics were just trending down. There was just less students and less teachers overall. If you look at the 20 years prior, payroll growth was basically flat, maybe trending slightly down. So to have an assumption that it was going to grow was not really a good decision, because what it would do is we would assume there'd be a certain amount of payroll and we'd base our annual payment on it. Well, that number would come in short once they would actually do the accounting for it. So what I said was, all right, this is what we'll do. I would agree to changing the contribution rate floor from a rate to a dollar amount, but in exchange we will lower the payroll growth over time. And that's what House Bill 5355 was. So if you look at the language for House Bill 5355, instead of it being a contribution rate floor, it's a floor that's based on what's called a sum due and payable. So that was the deal. We would change how the floor funding was designed, in order to lower the payroll growth over time. So I was very happy with House Bill 5355. I think it did a lot to try to make our system more solvent and more prudently designed over the long term. So what ended up happening with that? Well, it's funny that these two mechanisms I put in place to try to try to get more money to go into the system were precisely what Governor Whitmer went after. The first video I talked about was going after the payroll growth assumption, and now this video is going after the floor funding provision. So what's the whole rub here? Well, first off, in Governor Whitmer's executive recommended budget, she surprised me in February of saying that they found $670 million of what they called at the time savings. They argued that since the retiree healthcare system, the OPEB, was now fully funded, that those funds could now go back into the school aid fund and be spent on other priorities. And I could not wrap my head around how they were doing this because the floor funding provision applies to the MPSERS system as a whole. So how could they get around this floor funding provision? So at first I sent a letter to ORS basically asking for what does this new schedule look like for our debt? Basically provide me two schedules, please. Provide a schedule of our payments going forward if we don't remove the floor funding, and then what's it look like if we do. I wanted to see how much this was going to cost more over time. They did respond to that letter, and through that and through when they came to committee and testified, I was able to determine they don't see one floor, they see two floors. They see a floor for the pension system, and they see a floor for the retiree health care. Well, if you look at the plain language of House Bill 5355, if you look at all the analysis from when that bill was signed into a law, it was one system. There's only one floor. If you go back to that negotiation, I never would have agreed to any type of deal where I would have allowed money to not go into the system, where less money would have gone into the system. That would have been completely counterintuitive to what the entire intent of the legislation was. So here we have the governor's proposing $670 million to be taken out of the system. So I sent a second letter after finding out that they're viewing this as two different floors. We had committee where I was actually able to directly ask the ORS director, how did you come to this determination that there's two different floors? And his response was that they had consulted with the Attorney General's office, and they had come up with I don't know if it was a formal opinion, I don't know if it was a recommendation, I don't know what exactly the communications were, but they came to this interpretation that there's two different floors. So then I sent this second letter to ORS asking, could you please provide the documentation of your communications with the Attorney General's office? I'd like to know, what is the legal basis for this interpretation of there being two floors? When did this communication happen? Any information you have, please provide it. I sent that back in April, still have had no response and still waiting. This is quite typical from bureaucrats I have found in my time in the legislature. Their two biggest tactics is to, one, withhold information, and two, wait people out. They think legislators come and go, so if we just wait them out long enough, we'll get our way. I was able to stop them once with the first raid. I'm going to not give up on this one. I'm going to keep going, and we will get to the bottom of when and what this communication was. So I'm not the only person who has the interpretation that there's one floor. There was an article in Crane's Business Detroit in February by Dave Eggert. I'll put a link in the description here. I'm going to quote one little part here. It's from the research director at the Nonpartisan Citizens Research Council of Michigan. They said that without a statutory change sought by Whitmer, he interprets the law to say that contributions made by employers and the state cannot drop until all liabilities, pension, and health care are paid off. Directing $670 million to the pension portion would be like making an additional principal-only mortgage payment, he said. I'm not the only person with this interpretation. It's the plain language of the law that there's one floor. That's what the legislative intent was. there is a Senate bill, Senate Bill 911, that the Legislative Democrats have passed that tries to deal with this floor funding diversion of funds, if you will. Basically what it would do is that law would just exempt this upcoming fiscal year from the floor funding. It gets pretty technical there. I'm going to wait and see what they finally come out with the language to see if they actually just eliminate the floor or if they just have a one-year exemption of what they finally do. I was going to wait until they were done with that legislation before making this video, but I don't know when they're going to pass that legislation. There's a question if they even need to do it before September 30th. There seems to be a lot of tension between the governor's office and the legislature of what that final bill is going to look like, because it deals with things outside of the floor funding as well. So maybe I'll make another video when that becomes final. But the bottom line here is the funds have already been diverted. The budget's been signed into law. They're already banking on this $670 million in both the school budget and the community college budget. So it's all been spent. The diversion of funds has happened. The new fiscal year starts on October 1st. So I wanted to give everybody the facts of what is going on. This can be really confusing. One thing that the Democrats will do is if they can just get people to a point of being confused, then they've won. So I'm trying to give everybody the facts as to the history of all this, and let people make up their mind for themselves. Because at the end of the day, it's not even a legal question to me. It's a question of what's a good idea or a bad idea. Is it a bad idea for a system that is over $30 billion in debt to divert funds away from it? Or is it a better idea to keep making your debt payments in order to save money over the long term? I think it's better to continue to make your debt payments on a sustainable manner so you can reach that finish line and pay off your debt. The Democrats have a different strategy. They want to divert the funds and spend them now and let our debt balloon over time. So I hope you enjoy this video. It's a pretty technical topic, but it's a super, super important one that's going to have long-term implications. And, I hope I can stop this diversion of funds in the future. So I appreciate your time, and thank you, and God bless.